and actually score their responses.
Okay. As a result of applying those protocols, what did you conclude?
Ms. Hurd did not have PTSD, and there were also pretty significant indications that she was grossly exaggerating symptoms of PTSD when asked about them.
How did you make that latter conclusion?
So one of the strengths of this test, as I mentioned, the important thing about any test used when you're doing an evaluation in forensics is to make sure that the person is responding accurately. And this test does that by not just asking people whether they have a symptom, but asking follow-up questions that draw out very detailed accounts of every single symptom of PTSD. And when you're really familiar with this disorder, which you need to be to administer this test, there are nuances in the way a person will describe their symptoms that have been shown repeatedly to indicate exaggeration or faking. There are also indications when somebody is clearly giving you a genuine response.
Okay. What, if any, symptoms of PTSD did you observe in Ms. Hurd?
So there are 20 kind of core symptoms that somebody can manifest with PTSD. You don't have to have all of them. Ms. Hurd initially said that she had, in the first question, you say, do you ever have this, before you get to the more nuanced follow-up questions. When I asked that first question on each item, she initially said, yes, I have that, to 19 of the 20 symptoms. That's not typical even of somebody with the most disabling form of PTSD. When we eventually sort of dialed it down, she had 3 remaining symptoms. And having symptoms of any disorder is common for all of us. Some of us struggle with sleep. Some of us get anxious. It could be several different disorders. It could just be that you have this struggle in your life. But she had 3 specific symptoms that I scored as present. Off the top of my head, I might miss one, but one was sleep disturbance. So she reported that she has frequent nightmares. Another one was that she said that she tends to have a startle response. So if she gets startled or surprised, she tends to stay in sort of a hyper startle mode for quite a while. And that's consistent with a couple of things. It can be consistent with PTSD if other criteria are met. It's also consistent with childhood complex trauma, which is something that can occur when your brain is forming. If you constantly feel unsafe, if your parents are abusive, or if they're not present, if you're neglected, you can develop certain physiological responses that can stay for a long time in your life. So I noted that seemed like a very genuine, accurate account where she stays in the state of kind of hyper arousal, has a hard time calming down if she gets surprised.
You mentioned nightmares as well.
Yes.
Did she recount for you the nature of the nightmares?
So they were vague. She indicated that she has recurrent nightmares and that she feels as though she's being held down. And there was some conflict in that account because even though that could be a PTSD symptom, it is fairly vague, but I still scored it as present. And in her initial treatment with with Dr. Bonnie Jacobs, which I believe started before she began dating Mr. Depp, she had indicated to Dr. Jacobs, according to Dr. Jacobs's notes, that she was having repetitive nightmares back then and that they were related to her childhood trauma. And so that came up several times in the notes. Dr. Jacobs kept mentioning that.
Thank you. What is feigning?
Feigning is essentially faking or exaggerating symptoms that aren't present.
Does the CAPS-5 control for that?
It doesn't necessarily control for it. It can expose it by drawing out
How does that work?
Because you're not just simply handing the person a checklist that says, here are all the symptoms of PTSD. Why don't just check off the ones you have, which clearly if you're trying to look like you have PTSD, you would just check them all. The CAPS-5, because it requires them to describe in detail how they experience the symptom, where it shows up, what it looks like, what sort of examples they can give you, how many times it's happened in the last couple weeks, how many times it's happened in the last month. By the end of each symptom, you've gotten a very good picture of a couple things. One, does it meet the definition of the symptom? Are they getting it right? Is this actually the symptom, or are they kind of confusing this with something else? Number two, are they giving you very vague accounts? Are they giving you kind of a stereotyped idea of what the symptom is based on media or movies or something that actually is completely different from genuine experiences of this symptom? Or are they giving you a very genuine, heartfelt, sometimes minimizing, but it's ticking all the boxes? Their mannerisms while they're describing it, the actual very specific, very nuanced, symbolic ways they're describing it. A lot of times it smells, it sounds. That all appears in genuine accounts, and it's something that people really get wrong when they're feigning.
All right. In addition to your conclusion that Ms. Heard does not have PTSD, did you make a conclusion with respect to her symptoms?
Yes, actually I did. So, just because somebody doesn't have PTSD doesn't mean that they weren't harmed psychologically by whatever is being alleged. In this case, Ms. Heard is alleging that she was psychologically harmed and that she suffered PTSD because of abuse that she alleges occurred by Mr. Depp. So the MMPI too is helpful because it shows you kind of everything, any other symptoms. And then in Ms. Heard's own self-report and her prior treatment records, I knew that she had reported to me that she had had some other symptoms. So now what becomes really important is determining, and let me clarify one thing here, not so much a diagnosis, but did she start to experience symptoms during the relationship and after? Did they worsen after? Or could these types of symptoms or reports be explained by other factors? A, by feigning, B, by pre-existing conditions, or C, by other stressful life events that might have occurred. So the main symptoms that I was looking at didn't meet criteria for PTSD, right? There was also substantial evidence of this sort of emotional dysregulation, emotional disorganization, the shallowness, the dramatic affect. Now, when you have a lot of childhood trauma, you can actually have some similar type presentation in adulthood. There are some differences though, but also that's not something that would have occurred after this relationship. So now I was looking at, are there indications that these types of things that she's described, this transient anxiety, the issues with sleep, were these there prior? And sure enough, Ms. Heard, in her own self-report, stated to me that when she first got to LA, she was seeking treatment for, in her words, blanket anxiety and depression. She also reported that she was taking medications. In general, none of them were helpful. That's actually very typical of borderline personality disorder. Medications typically aren't very helpful for somebody with the disorder. They really need an intensive, lifelong type of therapy, which is not necessarily as relevant to this. But interestingly also, people with borderline personality disorder often respond really positively to stimulant medications that are given for ADD or ADHD. And in one of Nurse Filati's notes, she reported that Ms. Heard told her that none of the medications were working for her except for one Provigil, which is often prescribed as a stimulant medication. And I just thought that was interesting and sort of consistent with more of these lifelong personality disorders that aren't necessarily caused by a harm by any allegations, but have been there and will remain there typically. The other issue, so the anxiety, she had already indicated that had been there prior, but the form of the anxiety. So looking at Dr. Hughes's testing and then also looking at the scores on the MMPI, when you look at all these little combinations of the scores, you can actually learn a lot about, is the anxiety related to an event, or is this more a person who tends to be an anxious person regardless of what's going on in their life? And somebody might describe them as a worrywart. And the scores, the little combination of scores that she obtained actually indicated that it was the latter, that her anxiety tends to be separate from events and more just kind of a constant, and it comes and goes, but it's more of a trait.
I have no further questions for this witness.
All right. Maybe why don't we go ahead and, Ms. Bray, go ahead and have our lunch break. It might be a good idea to break it up there. Okay, I know. I can see you jumping up. All right.